So, Alex, what's your interest in racial justice?
Well, that's a good question. I think that I'm from a white mum and a Ghanaian dad, and so I think it's just been something. It's why I laugh when you ask me the question. It's just something that you live with your whole life, in a sense of just kind of bringing things together. So I think my heart in the whole thing is really just that we can appreciate difference, really, and work together really, really well, from different cultures, different backgrounds, and that kind of thing. So I think that's my real heart for it. Is that my real heart is that heaven comes to earth in it all. Just to put it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Sally, your interest?
Well, I'm a lecturer in sociology, and one of the courses I lecture in looks at how Europeans came up with a concept of race that's still got an ongoing legacy. I'm particularly interested in why white people find it so difficult to have this conversation. So ideas of white fragility are really interesting to me. I'm from the London Borough of Newham, which is one of the most hyper-diverse boroughs globally. So this gives us a way of experiencing cultural difference in a really interesting and usually positive way. I'm also very interested in the idea of how we're not just called to protest, but to kind of be prophets who will live into the future that we imagine. So it's very personal in that this is something I'm attempting to do, but not always very successfully.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Yinka, your interest in racial justice?
Well, I don't claim to be a social activist of any kind, but I think what happened with George Floyd really made it clear to me that I couldn't be a bystander. I also found myself in a position, unfortunately, not one of my choosing, in which I was one of the few, in brackets, national Black leaders at a time when that happened. So I had to do something. I had to step up to the plate. I think it's something God is highlighting in a moment in time right now, and none of us kind of look away. I think it's God that's brought this to the surface in the way He has, which means anybody that chooses to look away is really looking away at what God is actually declaring now as a Rhema word. So my interest really is summed up in, I want to see the next generation have a better level playing field than we've ever had.
Nice one. Gail.
Okay, so I think for me, it stems from being a Windrush descendant. So my parents, their story is shaped by racial justice or injustice, struggling for racial justice. I think it also stems from working with young people, young adults, and experiencing some of the issues around identity that they have, where they don't feel affirmed because of their racialized identity. So for me, I have a real passion that people feel affirmed, and the church, I think, is not playing enough of a role in that. I think there's a neglect in terms of church seeing it as central to ministry and mission. So that for me is a huge motivator.
Okay, Mike.
Yeah, like Gail, I'm a second generation Windrush, a Jamaican family who came to the UK in the 1950s. And I'm sort of growing up, even as a teenager, being anti-racist was really important to me. As a theologian, as a minister, I'm a Black liberation theologian, so I'm really interested in how we ground this theologically in our missional practice and in what it means to be Christian and human.
Okay, and myself, like Gail and Mike, my parents are Jamaican. I was born in Wolverhampton. During my teenage years, we had to battle against things like Ku Klux Klan and bricks through windows. And it's funny how much of it you actually forget until something like George Floyd kicks off and kicks you all off again. And you begin to remember some of the stuff that you underwent. In Bristol, I was far more active in racial justice. When I was in London as a student, I served in Sally's Church, but while I was in London as well, we were part of the Racial Justice, National Racial Justice Committee back in the 80s. And when George Floyd died, when I saw two little teenage girls in Hereford, white teenage girls in Hereford say, George Floyd's death matters to us, I wondered why it didn't matter as much to me, and I had to give myself a bit of a wake-up call. So, yes, racial justice. Yinka, can you tell me why you were inspired to call a meeting of ministers of colour, and what were the 2 or 3 things we focused on from that group?
Yeah, so the reason why we called together ministers of color from across the country was when the George Floyd stuff happened, I began to educate myself, and I began to write down what I was learning on Facebook. Some of you might have seen the posts that I put down. I had to admit and acknowledge that racism does exist, actually. It exists in society, but it also exists in the church. And the level of racism, something which I was not aware of before, so we just take one statistic, and I don't want to bore anybody with statistics here, but I could go on for an hour on just statistics alone. But just take one statistic. In every police force in the United Kingdom, Black people are a multiple number of times more likely to be stopped than their white counterparts, even though they're not, as a people of color, they're not any more criminogenic. There's no more, there's no greater incidence of criminality amongst Black people as there is amongst white people. So it tells you that there's institutional racism in the police force, but it's also within the church. I had in Reading, one other example, in Reading, one bishop that came, a white bishop, that came to speak at the Globe. Some of you will know the Globe. The Globe is the largest Black church in Reading. They've got about 1,000 members. They've got the most beautiful premises in the town, the most beautiful building in the town. And the white bishop walked into the building and said, "Oh, who owns this building?" And it was pointed out it was this Black pastor. And he said, and was overheard by the local elders to say that shouldn't be allowed. They shouldn't have this kind of facility. So racism exists, right in the church. It exists outside of the church. And the calling together the ministers of color was actually there needed to be some kind of legitimacy was what we're trying to achieve and accomplish. And we needed to hear all the voices. And so the calling together of the ministers of color was an attempt to hear the experience and to have a platform where it wasn't about pushing our agendas and our church programs and all that, but to actually educate ourselves and to encourage one another. Out of it came a couple of objectives. One of them was to try and see if we couldn't facilitate some kind of petition. Another was to call the march. The feeling was that if we don't do something, and I was told by 2 of the 6 presidents of churches together in England, I wouldn't mention the names, I won't say who, I was told by 2 of them that young millennials were already saying, where are the Black ministers? What are they doing? Are they sitting in their churches counting their offerings? Why are they not out with us on the streets? So, it was an identificational thing. We needed to do something to identify with them. And actually the gathering together was to try and understand what we needed to do. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. It was a beautiful day, that march, and though there wasn't as many of us as there were when 10,000 people stormed Parliament Square a few weeks earlier, what do you think some of the things we were able to achieve from calling ministers of colour together and after going on the march? Mike, I wonder if you could chip in on that one.
Yeah, I think what it did, I've reflected on it a lot, and one of the reasons why it was great so many people did come out, and I want to say thank you to a number of people who are on this conference call who did come out. A number of people from Fresh Streams regular who did come out and stand with us. But one of the things that I realised is that actually in the British church there is not a tradition of protest. That hasn't been part of our tradition, and it was very interesting. I was watching. I've protested a lot in my time, but I was watching people even on the day when we were marching, and some people, to be honest with you, were quite nervous. Nothing wrong with that. but there was a lot of nervousness, and you realise, well, they've never done this before. So actually, for me, it was about giving the church confidence to have a voice in the public square around the whole issue of racial justice, and it was incredibly liberating. And you know, as we marched down past 10 Downing Street, down Whitehall, it was just incredible as our voices as Christians echoed down Whitehall to say enough is enough. We want action on behalf of our government. And I tell you what, the thing I was really concerned about was that this protest moment would come and go, and the church would not have had its voice on the street. And as I look back and reflect on it, I realised, now please correct me if I'm wrong, there were lots of Christians who were involved in various Black Lives Matter protests, and certainly I was involved in some here in Birmingham. But I don't know of any other Christian-led protest in 2020 in the UK. And so, despite the naysayers, I'm so glad we did it. And I'm so glad that the church can say in 2020 it had a voice standing against racial justice and saying enough is enough, and Black lives matter.
Brilliant. I think all of us who were contributing today were on the march. I just wondered if anybody else wanted to chip in either one thing that was a direct result of having done the march, or possibly one thing they thought was really beautiful about the day.
Yeah, I think it was. I also think it was something very important spiritually. It was kind of a prophetic declaration of the way God sees things, and you know, we took the knee and prayed the Lord's Prayer and stretched our hands towards Parliament as a spiritual act, and I believe it did something in the spirit as well. And what was the most amazing thing was that after kind of, you know, responding to God in that way and prophetically declaring things and praying over things, you know, there a lot has opened up in terms of, you know, suddenly we had politicians wanting to speak with us. We literally had meetings with Keir Starmer and other politicians. Some of us had discussions with Conservative politicians as well. So it suddenly opened the door. We did something in the natural, you know, a protest and a prophetic act and a prayer. But that then, I think by being obedient to God in that way, it then opened something up for the church to have a voice into Parliament. So I think that was also, you know, very significant.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just one more. Jonathan, you were there. Jonathan, what did you feel about that demonstration that we went on in London?
I think it was a powerful prophetic moment. I think, you know, Mike led us in some prayer that was like a prophetic pronouncement. For me, I was there with my son, who was 15 at the time. He turned 16 this week. And I wanted him to see that the church wasn't silent on this issue. And I'm not going to reveal conversations, it's not fair to, but Yinka and I had some conversations about things happening in his family, reflecting on those things happening in my family. And, you know, my own son and I felt, you know, we couldn't be silent. And so for us, it was, you know, a very powerful moment, a milestone in my son's life and my life together, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to move the question on. Thank you for that, Jonathan. It was great to see you. Jonathan was pastor in Wolverhampton, where I grew up, and he was the cultural attaché to Hanover in Jamaica, which is the place where my father comes from. So I got a lot of time for Jonathan. He's a brother. Okay. Next question then is, why is developing a biblical narrative or a theological perspective on racial justice important? I'll throw that out to Alex and Gail.
Shall I go first, Gail, or do you want to go first? Okay. Well, to me, this is really, really important, because I think when it comes to issues of you know, morality or social issues or anything like this, often we immediately go into what I'd call the flesh, or go into a box where, oh, you're doing left-wing extreme politics now, or you're doing right-wing extreme politics now. So, you know, if you stand up and say, you know, I'm against abortion because I believe, you know, I believe in protecting life, suddenly you're this right-wing moral majority person, you know. If you say I'm against I'm anti-racist and I'm standing against, suddenly you're this left-wing Marxist, you know. So and so I think it's really important that we come from the heart of God, and that basically our basis, I think, you know, understanding our theology, our basis is biblical, i.e. we all came from the same offspring. We're told that in Acts 17, that all the nations came out of one man, and that we're just very solidly biblical with that, that we're theologically on track in terms of we're representing that unity and diversity of the triune God and perichoresis and the way we interact with each other, that we're a reflection of that on the earth. So we're actually bringing heaven to earth. And I think kind of realizing that even race, which I know Sally has done a lot of study into, is a social construct, you know, and is completely non-scientific, and that's been proved through, you know, even the recent genetics and tracing of the genome and everything else. It's been declared the concept of race has no genetic or scientific basis. So effectively, if we are talking about race, it's just a social construct. It's something that was developed in the 1900s to justify slavery, and we just need to understand that. And therefore, if we think theologically, we think spiritually, we think biblically, then we know that we're coming into that actually the answer is in Christ. So I think that's why it's important to think that way. Obviously, I'm just summarizing very quickly, and I'm sure there's lots of things you would want to ask me and tear apart of what I've said, but I'm just throwing that out there very quickly.
I'll let Sally tear you apart later.
Okay.
I'm going to support what you've said, Alex.
Okay.
Hallelujah. Okay, Gail.
Yeah, I think for me, I spent 5 years working in a regional Baptist association and 6 years in a Baptist college. And I during that time, I was very disturbed by how many ministers see issues around racial justice and equality as an add-on and not core to their ministry and mission. And so for me, having a theological basis is so important. People seeing this as core to what we do, as being Christians. If we talk about the kingdom of God and what it's like, it is one where racial justice, racial equality is at the center, and it's important. And for me, I find it incredible that people can undergo years of ministerial formation and training and come out without that core understanding. It should shape all that we see and do and the way we are. It also, for me, means that people miss so many of the dimensions in scripture. At the core of scripture that we read, the Bible, etc., we see instances. If we think about the Old Testament, we see Miriam, her reaction to Moses's wife, who is a dark-skinned woman. God's response. So God really deals very strongly of issues of ethnic difference, where we are not treating people as equal or justly. God really doesn't have time for it. And I think that sometimes people read scriptures like that without the lens of ethnicity or racialized identity, and they miss how this is a core issue for God. It's a justice issue. Similarly, we can look at the New Testament. We look at Acts and the calling of the seven. When we don't see ethnicity or the racialized identity that shape our lives in society, we miss what God has to say into those issues. So we then get younger generations, young people, many people who see the church as irrelevant. And my heart breaks for the number of young people, young adults I engage with, who see the church, see Christ as irrelevant. And it's because I believe we are missing what is a core issue in our society that's been highlighted last year, which is impacting so many people's everyday experience. But we're not engaging with it theologically. So we are missing how much God has to say on this issue. We're making ourselves irrelevant by ignoring the issue of racial justice and equality.
Okay. Jonathan, you wanted to say something, did you? No, I saw a thumbs up.
No, I was just agreeing with Gail.
You're agreeing.
You know,
Okay.
it's a good habit to develop. I was just agreeing with Gail.
Nice one, nice one. Okay, just looking in the, just make sure you're reading through the chat. Lynn has highlighted that the Bishop of Leicester led an event outside Leicester Cathedral along the lines of Black Lives Matter, indicating that when we knelt on our protest, that was a very powerful occasion and helped her to identify even more so with her Black family's pain. And then she puts on again something she'll bring up about the Bible being used to justify white supremacy. She'll possibly pick that up in a question I'll ask her in a little bit. But before I ask her that question, I want to come back to you, Mike. Mike, on this protest, we were walking down the road and we were saying things like Black Lives Matter to Jesus. And I think I heard you shout out loud, it's Black Lives Matter, as we went down the streets of London. Three little words, Black Lives Matter, throws such confusion and such fuss around church and Christian circles. Why do we need not to be worried about those three words? Or just tell me your feeling about those three words.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is all lives will matter when Black Lives Matter, because the truth is that as Black people, our lived experience is one that our lives have not mattered, that often we have been treated as second or third class citizens for no other reason than our colour. I do think that some people sometimes are looking in the small print to find a reason why they can opt out. And I think that Black Lives Matter, BLM, is one of those things where they can find some small print. And so, you know, they stand up and say, oh, wow, well, it was, you know, started by, you know, 3 queer women. So, you know, I'd rather kind of, kind of opt out. Or perhaps they say, well, you know, they're saying things about the family and about the family unit that we don't agree with. There are lots of things that various political parties say that I don't agree with, but I still go to the voting booth and vote for the particular political party that I've decided to support. We don't have to agree on everything to be able to support the issue of justice and to stand for racial justice. There are a variety of theological opinions on this call, but we can still stand together. But I see so many people looking to opt out because there are 1 or 2 fine small print things that they feel, I found a reason why I can be silent. Well, your silence is violence, as one of the young girls on the estate where I live have put in their front window, which I walk past every single morning. What saddens me is that not only are some people deciding that is a reason why they will opt out and be silent, but some people have actually set their face against Black Lives Matter and have decided that actually they're going to stand against those who are seeking to be anti-racist.
Okay, so there's 3 words, very powerful words, belong to a particular party, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the 3 words are very important. Black Lives Matter, and as you started off by reminding us that all lives matter, and as people will tell us, but if Black lives don't matter, no lives matter. So thank you for going into that for us, Mike. I'm just going to move on to a question for Gail and Sally. Is it ever right to demonstrate? Both of you on demonstration. I'll out you now. Both of you on the demonstration. Is it right to demonstrate for justice? And how can we support young people in particular when they are looking to stand for racial justice?
Which one do you want to take, Gail?
You go for it, I'll follow.
Okay, so yeah, I think that protest is a legitimate way to express your Christian faith. I do think we need to move beyond sort of simply yelling at the world as it is, to trying to be prophetic in the way we live, and to model in a flawed way the justice society that we believe models the kingdom of God. So I think I've always actually been on protest. I can remember taking my daughter on protest, just as a way of saying that there is a time to put your physical body where your heart is. And there's something very powerful about doing that, actually, taking your physical body. So I don't really get protest, which means you just click on a link on Facebook or something. But I think when you take your physical body and join it with other people in a place, and you're amplifying the voices of people who are not often heard, then that is something that to me is at the heart of trying to live for Jesus and justice. I do think it's important we don't just pick an issue and then move on from it, you know, and the next trendy issue, we're part of that. We have to be able to work these things through in our living.
I think for me, I start by simply saying this: if it wasn't for Christians protesting, people like me would still be in shackles. I come from a tradition, Jamaican background, where you had the likes of Sam Sharp, a Jamaican Baptist deacon who led a protest against slavery, which played a huge role in bringing about freedom. It started a reaction in terms of the abolition of slavery and so forth. So for me, I think that I stand within a tradition, linking to what Mike said earlier. I think there's a tradition within Christianity of protest, but for some reason within our British context here in the UK, we see little evidence of it in recent times. I think if you were to look at maybe a century ago, I think there was more a heart for protest within the church. When you think about things like the suffragettes movement, that was, you know, involved women, and actually there was a separate movement that emerged from the church along those lines. So I think absolutely is the answer. There is a need to protest, and thinking about the young people that led a lot of the protests last year, I think for them, I mean, there were challenges about the timing of it. We were in the middle of a pandemic, and I know there was some issues around that for many people. But what was key, and some of the young people I know that joined protests, was recognizing, as we would say, it was a Kairos moment. It was a moment in time where there was an opportunity to raise the profile of an issue that had been ignored for so long, thinking specifically about the church, thinking about how so many people of colour have suffered for years, for centuries, without the church responding appropriately. A moment arose where I believe many young people sensed, in a way, perhaps youth gives you that freedom. You don't have the baggage that sometimes you have as you get older. They sensed that moment, they seized it, and they went for it. And I think the fruit that will flow from that has the potential to make significant change, already has. And so for in terms of how we support them, I think we help them in terms of sharing our experience, our insight. One of the things that I'm aware of is sometimes younger generations, because of their limited life experience, don't know some of the history. Some things have been done before, tried before, they haven't worked, they have worked. I think we have some insight to offer to help support them, and physically stand with them, again, saying what Sally has said. But for me, absolutely, the protest is an important thing that the church needs to reclaim. It should be part of our DNA and our history that we embrace.
Okay. Ladies, thank you. Gareth, you got your hand raised. Is a question or comment you want to make?
I mean, I suppose it's half a question, half a comment. I mean, the march that we did was definitely my first time protesting, which was an interesting and joyful experience, and you know, I loved it. What I was really interested in, because obviously life has a tendency just to move on, You know, that's what happens. And even if you think about just these last couple of weeks, like most of us that are now pastors are now having to help people navigate right-wing conspiracy theories, QAnon, freedom of speech, people being banned on Twitter. Is that right? Isn't that right? And something that's just as important as this gets lost, you know. And I just checked back to the petition that you guys then sent out afterwards. And I think when you sent it out, I checked it and it had about 2,500 signatures on it already. It's now got just over 4,000 signatures. So on the back of all that noise, all the craziness of Facebook posts back and forwards, everyone getting really upset, trying to work things through, and then actually the next step on, you've got like 1,000 extra signatures, which is nothing, and the petition hasn't even reached the threshold to be acknowledged by Parliament, never mind taken for a debate. And so my question back to you is, what I mean, and you may not even have an answer for that, but what do we do? Because to me that's awful, almost, that we didn't even get that petition to 10,000, never mind 100,000 signatures. You know, so what can we do about that?
Okay, anybody want to take that? I'm going to throw it at Yinka. Yinka, what do you say?
I'm really keen to hear what Mike's going to say as well, by the way. How I wish I was not the president of the Baptist Union of Great Britain. I would say a few things right now. I'd say a few things about, you know, that folk got more het up and there was a greater take up of meeting on Sundays. Because the petition was out about getting Sundays, getting the government to change their mind and allow people to worship on Sundays. There were more people involved in that, which says something about the value that the church in our nation places on Black lives. And I think, and I could say an awful lot more, but I will hold my tongue until after the presidency. Mike, I'll leave it to you to say.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. Firstly, actually, the system of registering protests is really interesting. Not until you try and register a protest, you actually realise that actually the system's rigged, if I may say so. And so actually, between us registering a protest, and then, you know, there was quite a hiatus, a number of weeks, before we were then told that actually someone else had already registered it, and therefore we couldn't register it. And so what we had to then do was take what was someone else's petition and to try and drive it through our own networks. It wasn't the same petition that we had put forward, but the government system felt it was near enough that we weren't allowed to put ours forward. And by that time, and the time lag between those things, and I understand there was COVID as well, meant that actually it wasn't our petition. The petition lost some kind of momentum. So actually, the system of petition is actually quite rigged, and it's kind of worth really pointing that out. What I will say is that there is a lot of political good that has come out of what we've done, and particularly the meeting with Sir Keir Starmer is actually a really clear outcome. The Labour Party has not met with Black church leaders for over a decade. And so for us as Black church leaders to sit down with a leader of the opposition and talk about these issues actually was monumental. And it has built bridges where the bridge was not just destroyed, it was non-existent.
That's really interesting there, Mike. And Alex, the talk with Sir Keir Starmer, a lot of the Black church leaders impressed upon the Labour Party to deal with their anti-Semitic views. And so even as we sat around the table, we were able to challenge the Labour Party on that. Keir Starmer seemed like a really genuine person, and he certainly took on board the things we had to say. And another key meeting was with David Lammy, when we started discussing the fulfillment of resolutions around racial justice issues that have cropped up over the years, where they've written many, many papers. David Lammy was absolutely brilliant.
Yep.
He calls himself a nailed-on Christian. And I think if we could ever get him to speak at a Baptist assembly or Baptist gathering, we would be incredibly, incredibly blessed. Well, time's going to run away, so let me just carry on with some questions. Before I go into my next question, Gareth, that was a great observation and question. Is there anybody else who just wants to ask something? Well, I'll just take a couple of seconds to regather myself. Adrian, is that a thumbs up? Yeah.
I don't know whether the panel would agree with this or not, but I take what Gareth was saying about trying to keep momentum going on this issue. But my sense, certainly in my lifetime, there feels to be something has shifted, particularly in the white psyche.
Yep.
And the fact that I attended a protest on Tootingback Common within about 10 days of George Floyd's death, and about 75 to 80% were white, and there was about 1,500 people there. It kind of, there's something which has been awakened, and I hope will never be put to sleep again.
Right.
And we're also getting regular things now in the news, aren't we? Just the difference in response to the Capitol Hill storming from Trump protesters as opposed to a peaceful Black BLM march. You know, these things are keeping it in our mind, I think. And so while the follow-up and the growing in numbers for that petition might be disappointing, I think something has shifted, and in society more generally. Certainly it's shifted within our own church. We've had to face issues as a multicultural church like we've never had to face them before. We've kind of glossed over, and we've got over 50 nationalities in our church, but we kind of glossed over all that. Whereas now we're having listening assemblies, we're having difficult conversations. To my mind, well, in my part of the world and in my contacts, my network, in kind of the white population, if you like, it does feel as something has shifted like it's never done in my lifetime before. I just wonder whether you'd agree with that, panel members. Despite the frustrations, has something fundamentally shifted?
I think one of the beauties of the march was the diversity of the crowd that was there. It was amazing. You know, I know the Heber ministers, the Heart of England Baptist ministers who were there. There seemed to be quite a few there supporting us and travelled down from the Midlands on the train or on the coach during the COVID lockdown period. Very surreal travelling on the underground with nobody in the carriages whatsoever. But they came down and took us down, and even those guys I've seen on Fresh Dreams, some of them I've just been able to say thank you for standing alongside us. And certainly Jonathan and his son were there. Some other people were there with their sons as well, taking them on their first protest and saying the church does stand for something. And like I said earlier, it was two white girls from Herefordshire, where there isn't a massive black population, let's face it, who stood up and said, Black lives matter to us. And I thought, gosh,
Beautiful.
gosh, if they are moved, I better be moved even more so. So, Adrian, that's an interesting observation. Anybody else on the panel want to?
Yeah, I think it's massively changed. I think there's been a massive shift. I was out for the Birmingham Black Lives Matter march. I mean, Birmingham is a very diverse city, but I would say that at least 50% of the people there were white, and that's a very, in a very diverse city, and young as well. And so this is being led by young people, by a new generation. And actually, as church leaders, and sadly we tend to be older, we're playing catch up. And this is why actually this feels a little bit frustrating, because actually we're saying, guys, society is way out in front.
Absolutely.
We are way behind the mark.
Absolutely.
Sally, I want to come to your question. Certain words have come into our recent conversation about racism and racial justice. Words like systemic racism, institutional racism, unconscious bias, white supremacy, white fragility. Sally, why do you think some white people have a difficulty in talking about racial justice without being scared?
I think, for instance, if we think about the abolition movement, as Christians in Britain, we like to claim, you know, that we were at the front of that abolitionist movement, and, you know, we've got films to prove it, you know, that the church was at the heart of it. But actually, the church was at the heart of the slavery movement, and the very idea that allowed slavery not to be a moral issue, because it wasn't seen as a moral issue. So many people who considered themselves were considered to be devout Christians were prominent slave owners, all the way back to St. John Hawkins. I was putting this in the chat, who was one of the first English slave traffickers in the 16th century. And he named his slave ships Jesus and Angel. And there was something about the European way of viewing race which allowed slavery to continue for the centuries that it did, and allowed Christians to be very much at the heart of African slavery. And I think it was this, it's what Alex was hinting at, that really it was back in the Enlightenment period that writers like Cesar Lombroso wrote this idea that there were separate human races. So if you ask somebody how many races there are today, it's a good thought experiment. Many people will say there are 3 races or 4 or 5 races. And this was an idea put out by Cesar Lombroso in the middle of the 19th century. And we still believe that there are racially separate groups of people. We still believe that you could be mixed race, for instance, whereas genetically, that's a complete anomaly. We all share genetic heritage. There is actually one original Eve. We all can trace ourselves back through evolutionary processes to an African woman. That doesn't mean that race doesn't exist. It exists as a powerful idea. And as soon as you have a structure in your mind that says, here is us and here's them and they're different from us, and in a European sense, that Africans were less evolved than Europeans. So Cesar Lombroso set up this idea of Caucasian, Mongoloid and Negroid. He wrote that into his essay on the inequality of the human races. That has framed the way that Europeans have viewed themselves, that they are the centre of time and space in the world. We drew the maps, look at the Mercator map. It goes through London, Greenwich. Time is divided up from London, from actually the Royal Naval College in London. And this has set up a system where white people view that they are separate from non-white people and they are superior to non-white people. And this justified colonialism, the original genocides of Latin America and Africa. It justified colonialism, it justified the empire, and it has not left our imagination. White people believe that they are separate and they are superior, and we better come to terms with that as white people. So when you challenge anything to do with that, it's a very uncomfortable conversation to have, because the basis of European identity is on racial separateness. I could say so much more, but I think that that's at the heart of it, really. And we need to understand as white people why we find this conversation different. Well, our history, our culture, our worldview is steeped in the idea of separateness and privilege.
Okay, thank you, Sally. It certainly is a case that when you talk to some people, they get really angry about the subject or really scared about the issues. Some white people get scared about the issues. Well, I remember broaching some of this with some of my older relatives. They used to get scared about the issue. Mike, I want to ask you, what would you say to white people who get angry and scared about racial justice being discussed?
I think it's about going on a journey. And I think that we kind of need to move away from the idea that I'm racist or I'm not racist, or balking at the idea of being accused of being racist. But actually, we need to see this much more on a continuum as becoming less racist, because all of us hold prejudice. Of course, racism is about power, but for me, it is about how can I use my privilege to enable others to have the opportunity in life and to be treated in society as a human being, equally in the same way that I would want to be treated. And so I think it's about becoming less racist, but also being deliberate about saying, actually, I'm going to be anti-racist. And I think we're at a critical point now, because what we have, and let's remember, and this is a slight political statement, but I do think it's true, that sadly, Make America Great Again and Brexit are joined at the hip. You only have to watch how Nigel Farage and gang were out in America campaigning for Trump to realize that. And actually, I think it's really important that we say we are uncomfortable with white nationalism as Christians, and actually we are going to be anti-racist. And if we don't, then there is a danger that Christianity is seen as synonymous with white supremacy. We are halfway there already.
Okay. It's obvious there's racism in every part of society, and racism in the church. Yinka has already said if he wasn't the president, to be able to say so much more. So I'm going to throw it open to the floor. Where do you think you see racism in the church? I'm going to throw it open to everybody. Just unmute yourself and just say a couple of words. Where do you think you see racism in the church today? Anybody can answer that question.
I mean, I've personally seen racism. I mean, I can say I've seen people be racist towards Yinka, going back, church leaders treating him in a certain way based on the fact that he's black. You know, I've seen it in Reading. You know, I've seen it with other black pastors in Reading, treated in a particular way because just based on their skin color.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. Adrian?
This is a question we asked in our listening assemblies. We set up white listening assemblies and black listening assemblies in our church, and each group could ask the other a question. And one of the questions the white assembly asked is that, so have you experienced racism in our church? And you know, how many of you, if you like? And the white assembly was shocked at the reply that yes, we have. It was almost a unanimous feeling, even though we pride ourselves as a multicultural church. And one of the ways it showed up for a lot of people was just not being seen. Just that they are never greeted by their white brothers and sisters in the church context. We tend to stick with our cliques, or they're greeted in the church, but then outside in the community, it's almost as if they don't even know who they are. A number of black friends said that one stopped to give a white member of the congregation a lift with their shopping, and they kind of backed off as if they were being assaulted. Didn't recognize them, and they were afraid of them, basically. And it's a sense of not being seen, not even being included in conversations. We were very shocked about that and humbled by that, the fact that we have been so blinkered in our relationships. We hadn't really been building across the racial or the ethnic divides within our church. And so that was a very humbling thing for us to hear.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm going to take one more. Ashley, your hands up.
Yeah, we're about a third non-white, and we've been actively working to get more breadth in terms of our leadership team. But it's just the laziness sometimes in language and things that really frustrates me. So when we talk about things starting on time, for example, or I suppose probably the most painful thing and the thing that I pushed back on most of all was when people are talking about one another who are part of the church and been in part of the church for a long time, and they say, well, I'm not quite sure which one it is. You know, that kind of, and I'm thinking, well, you should get to know each other a bit better. It just makes me sad. It just grieves me. But because it comes from people who you think should know better, who in other ways you think have a good walk with Christ, and yet they fall back into what I just think it's late. These lazy stereotypes, these lazy tropes around timekeeping. I mean, my constant response is always to pick on one of my deacons and say, yeah, but Sue's always late. Sue, by the way, is 40s and white. But it's just a way of just kind of pushing back and saying you're missing the point here. People are late, but they're late because they're bad timekeepers or have struggles getting their children ready or all sorts of other issues going on. But it's not because they're black, or So yeah, I think I see it all the time, and and it's in just such small things. And I think the other thing is the thing I kind of want to comment on. It's the not being able to put themselves in other people's shoes and realise there's a privilege and a bias that benefits them and doesn't benefit the other. That's just something that I find really hard. But sorry.
Okay, Ashley, thank you. And so Philip, was that you putting your hand up? Yeah, Philip.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it says Philip. My name's
sorry.
Judith. Actually, that's.
Sorry, Judith.
I can't know. Yinka showed me how to change it the other day, but I haven't worked it out today. My name's Judith. I think for me, the most powerful thing this year has been to read and understand more my white privilege, which I guess I've been vaguely aware of it before, but it's really come home to me. We are in a very white community where I live, and a very white church. But nevertheless, obviously, I'm in the world and in community, and it's recognizing, appreciating that, and beginning to try and change my understanding and read more. And forgive me if this is not how you see it, but I've talked to other young people I know, other people I know, and said, how can I learn more? Is it helpful to ask my Black friends, what's your experience? Or is actually that very painful for people to share? I wouldn't want to share about my most difficult moments. When my son's to say, read, mum, read more, read more. Is that your advice too?
Definitely. Education is one of those massive things that will help people begin to understand other people's culture, but building relationships and building friendships. In the last 10 minutes or so, we're just going to talk about how we as a church can begin to turn things around and begin to make a difference. And Gail, I noticed some of the practical things you do are by way of welcome and hospitality. So can you tell me how that helps within developing a culture of racial understanding?
I read a book years ago, Emmanuel Latte, around pastoral care and being intercultural. And it was the first time I came across his understanding, or the understanding he used in the book, rather, recognizing to some degree we are all like everyone else, part of the human race. To some degree, we're more like some people than others. So that might be women as opposed to men, or being, someone who is Black in terms of racialized identity versus someone who's white. And to some degree, we are all unique. In other words, there's only one Gail Richards born in Birmingham when she was. And so for me, I think that lays at the heart of how we welcome people, how we offer hospitality. And I think it's also how we break down some of the barriers. Part of the challenges in our churches is this idea that there's one way of doing things, one way of seeing things, and that one way of seeing or doing things just happens to be Eurocentric and doesn't have space for anything that has a different route to heritage, whether it's African, Asian, or etc. So for me, part of that is a commitment to welcoming the whole person. So when someone steps in the door, or if I'm serving in the wider community, I recognize the wholeness of that person and all that they bring with them. And I don't do it in a way that makes clumsy assumptions, because I recognize those things. To some degree, everyone is unique. I think those layers, that intercultural understanding, is so important as to how we welcome people and offer hospitality. How does that play out? I think there are simple things. We need a diversity of voices. We need to create space to hear different voices, perspectives. When we do things, we need to make sure we try and make sure we are aware of this. What I'm saying may seem like the simplest of things, but prayers of intercession, when we intercede, actually last year, when so much was going on around the issues of race, anti-Black racism, how many churches fail to even acknowledge that? How do I feel welcome in a space, in a church, when something that is so significant to who I am is not acknowledged or prayed into? Conversely, when I was in a space and someone did that, the welcome and the sense of belonging or whatever was huge. So I think for me, that's where we start, recognizing the whole person with those different dimensions. Where I am, we do lots of things. We have a house that we rent out, and part of who we house, it's a very diverse house in terms of where people come from. So they're living in a community where they are learning from different experiences, stories, etc. We offer English language classes for new arrivals. So again, the way in which we run them, it's a lot of it is about enabling dialogue, where there is a recognition that we have those dimensions to us. So the way in which we facilitate conversations, our conversational English, for example, there is a space for everyone to speak, and there is value given to their background, their heritage. We intentionally want to know about their experiences from their context. Everything we do throughout the year, in terms of our liturgical calendar, we try and be aware. So whether it's Windrush Day, Black History Month, there needs to be just a recognition of the whole person. It's no good just having a welcome sign with languages if you don't go any further. We need to be delving down. I care about this person. I want to know about this person. I want to be there for them. I want to be church with them. I want to reach out in every aspect, that wholeness. So, I mean, I've just offered some simple examples, but I'm sure others will have many, many other.
Okay, Gail, that's amazing. And already you getting some affirmations for that in the chat as well. So thank you. I just want, because time's going to run away from us, I just wonder, I'm going to put this question out to Alex, Mike, and Yinka in particular. What can churches do to show that they're serious about racial justice? Gail's given some examples. Well,
I'm going to jump in, just connect with what Gail has said there. I just think I think it is about attitude and heart. And I think it's about celebrating diversity. And again, I think this is why it really comes back down to having the heart of God and the word of God in the center of everything and being Christ-centered. Because you've only got to look at the way Christ reached out to people. He always broke all taboos, all cultural barriers, whether it's talking to the woman at the well, Samaritan, and a woman, all these different things. And I think we've only got to look at the examples that Jesus gave just to see that actually it's just about, and again, if you want to say, I want to be, anti-racist, you can end up still stereotyping. I'm now talking to black people, or I'm now talking to gypsies, or whatever you want to say it is. Do you know what I'm saying? So actually, it's about more the heart of Jesus. And I love what Gail said there. I just want to know you as a real human being and how you tick, and celebrate difference, because God is this incredible unity and diversity being, and we want to demonstrate that in our community. So one of the things, that I've done a lot, because I've been a long term in the church, I mean, we've prayed over the years to actually make sure we had diversity in the leadership, so that when you come into the church, oh, there's someone at the front that looks like me, or there's someone on the board that looks like that, I can be a part of this. So just that in every way that we operate, and I don't mean tokenism at all. That's why I said we pray about it. So it's not tokenism, oh, there's someone, let's put them. No, it's praying about it so the right person arises, but actually so that we're just this multifaceted celebration. And I grew up in a church when I was a teenager where we had a white American pastor. And in a way, it really helped because we were all from different backgrounds. They were first and second generation Africans, there were first and second generation Caribbeans, there were French people, there were Australians, there were, indigenous English. And so the norm was the kingdom of God. The norm was no one particular culture, it was the kingdom of God, or if you want to say a kingdom culture. So we all had to be open and learning and celebrating all the time. So I think I'm not answering the full question because I know others will jump in for that, Yinka and Mike, but I'm just saying, if we can demonstrate that as church, then actually we are now a little taste of heaven on earth, and we're actually being forerunners for the whole community. So that's just, I know I'm just only answering one aspect.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, you take one aspect there. Any other aspects, Mike?
Yeah, for me, I was going to maybe focus on the organisational, and our churches are organisations, and so actually we need to look at our churches. We need to look at representation in our churches. We need to look at leadership development in our churches. We need to do some work around attitudinal issues to diversity. And we need to have those really hard conversations around issues of diversity. And I think that we'll do ourselves a huge favour when people of colour see us taking those issues really, really seriously. And then at every level of the organisation, whether it's the leadership team, whether it's the deacons meeting, whether it's those who are ministering on the front line, we need to make sure that we're ministering with a real, having been educated about being sensitive to the needs of diverse communities in our communities, but also educated about their experience of racism in everyday life.
Yinka, I'm going to come back to you right at the end because I was just in a really interesting question from Tony. Tony's out in Shropshire, rural Shropshire. There's hardly any people of colour in Shropshire, and he asked the question, if it hasn't slipped off the screen, in an almost white locality, how do we or I help people see that this is our problem? Anybody want to tackle that one? How do we help people who, because even when I was in Bristol, there was a particularly white non-working class part of Bristol who never mixed with St. Paul's and Easton. We formed a football team league between these two teams. At the initial game, they kicked lumps out of each other, were scared of each other. By the end of the season, they realized they were two best teams, respected one another and congratulated one another. It was a massive move. But the guys in Hartcliffe said something in a manager's meeting and didn't understand that they said something wrong. So when some people just don't know, how do you help a congregation that's predominantly white and don't think it's got an issue at all?
I'll say something very quickly on this. The history of white working class communities in Britain, if you look at some of what happened kind of with the weaving industry and how actually decisions were taken that they were not going to receive cotton that was picked by slaves. These were white people in Britain who were not surrounded by black people, who took global decisions, and they didn't have social media in those days, that had repercussions around the globe. We're living in a global context. Our immediate context may be white, but actually what we do as white people matters globally. So actually we can look beyond ourselves and make a difference. And actually it's even more important that we do, because if we don't, then actually we're living in a bubble.
Hey.
I'm going to finish with the Inca, because we're going to finish at 4:30, so sorry about that. What things, Yinka, what things would you like Fresh Dreams to support people of color with in the field of racial justice?
So there's a number of initiatives that the BU are looking at, which really has encouraged me. So the senior leadership are looking at pathways that, medium term and long term, actually, whereby we can create a level playing field for people of color right across our movement, so that they can have access to power, because at the end of the day, it's access to power that transforms the ability of people of color to be able to not just encourage the next generation, but also to demonstrate that, we're equal partners and we can make a contribution too. So access to power is a critical aspect of this, and any denomination that genuinely wants to see create a level playing field has got to address this. And I'm really proud of the senior leadership of the BU. So they're looking at in terms of the short term, how can we encourage, identify people, if you like, of color whose voices need to be brought into the senior leadership so that they can contribute. So they're exploring that. And there's also discussions around, with other black people in our movement as to how we can make a difference. So I think the senior leadership are absolutely committed to a structural change in making sure there's access for people of color across the movement. So we can be proud about that. If you look at what's happening, so Fresh Streams helping in that process, one of the things that Fresh Streams could do as a movement is to facilitate that, is to help regional teams where they identify. I'm advocating for mentoring schemes, for example, because unless what mentoring does is it helps you to actually understand how to wield the levers of power. Think about barristers. How many black barristers do you know? And it's because it's a closed shop. It's a mentoring system that enables, keeps influence within a certain group of people. So I think Fresh Streams, if they can help identify black people, include people of color in senior leadership. In fact, if all our regional teams would proactively, I'm not talking about a positive discrimination, I'm talking about giving people a chance. Think about how they can create pathways so that people can compete for jobs and for positions in our movement. And I think we as Baptists are ideally suited, because we believe in the priesthood of all believers, we're ideally suited to making a difference. When you think about the church, and not being critical about any denomination here, but if you look across all our denominations, and in the UK, and you look at black leadership in it, it's very, very sparse indeed. I like what, and finally, just to finish off there, I like what Mike said about the North. I think actually our Northern white colleagues understand what prejudice actually looks like, and what discrimination looks like, and what lack of access to power looks like when everything is London-centric. So for me, I think there's a long way to go. I would encourage our movement to think about, if I can in any way, whatever little voice I've got, to think about the next generation and giving them the training, the coaching, the mentoring, so that it's not just about historic abuse, but it's about claiming the future for the next generation.
So in that way, we go back to the future. Nice one. I also want to just highlight that across a number of association justice hubs are starting up. And certainly in Heber, we have something called the Making a Difference Justice Hub. Our theme for the year is racial justice. I'll be talking to Wale Roberts, who's doing a number of things across the union as well. And so there's a number of ways we can be involved. I've really enjoyed the chat, watching the chat, how we've been able to answer one another's questions and provide some resources. But I'm really grateful for those who have taken part and all of you who've been able to attend today. I hope you found it useful. I hope you've found it useful and will want to go away and just examine or explore a little bit more about this theme of racial justice. You see, together, we can make the kingdom of God a beautiful, diverse place and win many souls of all kingdoms, languages, creeds to God. So thank you.